I stood in the marble foyer of my daughter Lydia's mansion, a home I once believed I had built for her future. Tonight it glowed with chandeliers, music, and the delighted hum of guests celebrating her promotion. Laughter bounced off the walls, glasses clinked, and cameras flashed as people posed with her. But in all that brightness, I stood invisible, holding a small, blue-wrapped box meant for her, on a day she didn't even remember was mine. I watched her, my 72-year-old heart tightening, as she laughed loudly, tossing her hair back for photos. She slung an arm around a coworker and joked, "My mom. Oh, she's here somewhere, but she's just visiting, not really part of the night." The group chuckled politely. My fingers trembled around the gift box. Inside, something wilted. A young guest brushed past me, champagne splashing onto my sleeve. He barely looked at me. "Sorry, ma'am. Staff should really stay in the kitchen area." Staff. That was what I had become in my own daughter's house. I swallowed the sting, gathered myself, and approached Lydia. "Sweetheart, it's my birthday today," I said, voice small but hopeful. She didn't even turn fully toward me. "Mom, please don't make this about you. Tonight is important for me. Can we not do this right now?" Her words sliced through me. The gift box slipped slightly in my grip. I should have walked away. But before I could move, she waved over a waiter and said sharply, "Can someone help my mother get an Uber?" Just like that, I was dismissed, pushed out from the party, from her world, from the life I had given everything to build. And in that moment, something in me cracked open. My voice, steady but shaking inside, echoed in my mind. She didn't even remember. My own daughter, the girl I raised alone, forgot the day I came into this world, but she was about to lose far more than a birthday. Stay with me till the end, because what happens after this will shock you. And if you love emotional revenge stories like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more. As the party's glitter faded, I found myself alone in my quiet home, the blue-wrapped box resting untouched beside me. The silence was louder than the celebration I had just left behind. My voice turned cold, sharper than I ever imagined it could be. "Let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand how a daughter becomes a stranger, and how a mother decides to erase her from a $50 million will." I remember those early mornings like they were painted in gold. Lydia, small and bright-eyed, would tumble out of bed, her laughter echoing through our modest apartment as I brewed coffee and set out bowls of cereal. Weekends meant baking cookies together, flour dusting the countertops, her tiny hands pressing dough into shapes, and the smell of vanilla and sugar filling every corner. Nights were quieter, with bedtime stories stretching into whispers, her head resting on my shoulder, trusting me with all she had. Those years were everything to me. Raising her alone after my husband passed had been exhausting, but the exhaustion was nothing compared to the joy of seeing her thrive. I worked long hours, sometimes 3 jobs at once, bookkeeping, sewing, tutoring children in the neighborhood, all to ensure she had opportunities I never did. I wanted her world to be brighter, bigger, full of doors she could open that were once closed to me, and she flourished. Every milestone she reached became a shared triumph. When she graduated college, the first in our family to do so, I sat front row at the ceremony, tears sliding down my cheeks, proud beyond words. I whispered to myself, I thought if I loved her enough, sacrificed enough, she would always remember who stood behind her. As Lydia climbed the ladder in the corporate world, I supported her quietly, helping with rent when her paycheck barely covered the apartment, paying for her first car, even covering portions of her student loans without being asked. I never wanted gratitude. Giving was its own reward. A mother's heart always gives. Even so, small cracks were beginning to show. She would forget to call back, brush off visits with "I'm busy," cancel plans at the last minute. At the time, I told myself it was simply the pressure of a young professional's life. I excused it, rationalized it, and hoped it was temporary. Meanwhile, I managed my own affairs, quietly and prudently. Decades of careful investments, real estate purchases, and inheritance from my parents had created a life of quiet wealth. Nothing flashy, nothing to flaunt, just stability, old money, elegance, and a calm, humble lifestyle. Lydia had no idea of its true extent, and I preferred it that way. She loved me, I thought, not the numbers on a page. If I had known how distance grows, how priorities shift, maybe I would have read the early signs. Maybe I would have seen the storm long before it came. I remember one Sunday lunch, a peaceful afternoon, sun streaming in through the kitchen window, when Lydia received a call and abruptly left. "Work emergency. Sorry, Mom. You understand. I smiled it off then, not knowing that this moment marked the first time I realized something crucial. Work wasn't pulling her away, someone else was. The first signs were so subtle that at the time, I almost missed them. Lydia had always been spirited, independent, but now there was a new edge to her small comments, slight dismissals, a tone that made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't yet name. It started with her boyfriend, Charles, polished, charming, his smile always just a little too perfect. He complimented me politely, but beneath the words was an undercurrent I didn't understand at first. One evening, as I complimented a piece of artwork in her apartment, he said lightly, "Beatrice, you're so traditional. You must have grown up without much money, right?" I smiled awkwardly, brushing it off, but a cold flicker passed through me. Lydia laughed along, as if it were all a joke. Yet I felt something shift, a quiet unease I couldn't shake. Calls became fewer. Visits were brushed off. "I'm busy," she would say, or, "Can we do it next week?" At the last possible moment, I excused it, convinced it was the rhythm of a young professional's life. But there was a new self-absorption in her, a focus that seemed to orbit around Charles and her work, leaving little room for the daughter I had raised with so much care. Then came the offhand remarks. One evening, as we shared tea, Charles leaned close and whispered, "Imagine what we could do with all this once it's ours." I froze. My eyes searched Lydia's face. She laughed lightly, brushing the comment aside, but there was a spark in her eyes, something calculating. The girl who once pressed dough into hearts on Sunday mornings now seemed to measure the world by what she could take, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear. Small acts began to pile up. She would forget Mother's Day, cancel visits without explanation, brag about her wealthy colleagues, the exclusive events she attended, and yet, she was still my daughter. I wanted to see her as that little girl who clung to me at bedtime, not this young woman growing distant, self-centered, and blind to my sacrifices. My internal monologue became a quiet prayer, repeated in hushed tones. Am I imagining this? Is it really greed, or just ambition? But deep down, I knew something was shifting, and I felt powerless to stop it. Then came the subtle but piercing moment that stayed with me. One afternoon, Lydia casually said, "Mom, you really should put the house in my name. It'll make things easier later." I looked at her, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Later for what?" I asked. She avoided the question, distracted, almost embarrassed, and changed the subject. But that seed had been planted, and the air between us changed forever. It was the first time I realized that my daughter, the girl I had sacrificed everything for, was beginning to see my life, my home, my love, as something she could claim, not cherish. The betrayal was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there, growing like a shadow in the corners of our once bright lives. As the years passed, the subtle cracks grew wider, and Lydia's behavior began to reveal something darker beneath her polished exterior. It wasn't just ambition anymore, it was entitlement, a quiet hunger that made my chest tighten every time she spoke. I started noticing it in the way she addressed me, her tone laced with impatience, her words carrying the weight of expectation rather than affection. Charles only reinforced it. His smiles were sharp, calculated, and his compliments felt like probes, testing boundaries I never knew were fragile. It began with small requests, disguised as suggestions. When she planned her wedding, Lydia said, "Just a small contribution from you, Mom, nothing major." I agreed without hesitation, wanting to be part of her happiness. But soon, the requests escalated. "Could you cover the venue, the catering? It's just a few thousand. You can manage it." And finally, the words that cut deeper than anything before. "Mom, Charles says you should want to pay for everything. It's tradition." My pleasure in giving turned into a gnawing discomfort. Their casual expectations masked an underlying greed that chilled me to the bone. I began to overhear things, little moments that pierced me with revelation. One afternoon, I caught Charles talking to Lydia in the living room. His words were soft, but the meaning was sharp. "She has the money. Why shouldn't she spend it? She won't be around forever." My hands clenched in my lap. Lydia nodded, her eyes bright but unreadable. I realized then that our love, the bond we had nurtured, was being measured in dollars and assets, and I was being reduced to a figure on a ledger rather than a mother in her daughter's life. The manipulation grew more obvious. She used my home as a backdrop for her celebrations, her social media posts, and Charles' ambitions. She spoke sharply in front of guests, correcting me casually, as though I were a stranger intruding in her carefully curated life. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was overreacting, questioning every memory, every laugh, every hug. Could love really transform into entitlement so quietly, so completely? The first real foreshadowing of the betrayal to come came from my financial advisor. He mentioned casually during a routine check-in, "Your will still lists Lydia as the sole heir. Just checking if that's still correct." I hesitated. For the first time, I questioned what I had assumed was certain, that my daughter loved me above all else. But now, I began to see the cracks more clearly, the glimmers of calculation behind her smiles, the cold curiosity in her eyes. Then came the moment that would haunt me. Overhearing Lydia tell a friend, laughing lightly, "Honestly, once Mom's estate transfers, everything will finally be easier. She doesn't need all that money at her age." That was the first time I understood my sacrifices. My love, my very presence had become a means to an end in her eyes. A mother's devotion, transformed into a stepping stone for her own gain. I closed the door quietly behind me, feeling both grief and something colder rising inside, a resolve that would change everything. For months, I tried to hold myself together. Outwardly, I smiled at Lydia's successes, complimented her achievements, and attended every dinner or gathering she expected me at. Inside, though, a storm raged quietly, invisible to everyone but me. I felt like a ghost in the life I had built, present, yet unseen. Nights were the worst. I would sit in my quiet home, the faint hum of the city outside like a reminder of the life I had sacrificed for hers, and my chest would ache with a loneliness that words could never capture. I kept asking myself, over and over, is it me? Am I too old-fashioned, too generous, too soft? Each missed phone call, each brusque comment, cut deeper than the last. I began to notice the pattern: the dinners she canceled at the last minute, the vacations she ignored, the way she no longer laughed at my stories. Lydia's ambition had become a wall between us, brick by brick, leaving me isolated in a world I thought was ours together. The financial decisions I had made, once a source of pride, now felt like a double-edged sword. Every investment, every property, every careful plan for her future had placed me in a position of silent power, but it didn't stop the emptiness. I felt the weight of my own generosity like a chain. My heart was full of love, but the silence in return was deafening. I would sit on the edge of my bed, the blue-wrapped box from years ago still tucked in a drawer, and imagine the conversations that could have been, the apologies that would never come, the recognition I would never receive. Some nights, I cried quietly, swallowing my tears before anyone could hear. My reflection in the mirror became a stranger's face, the elegant grandmother, the quiet provider, now appearing frail under the weight of disappointment. I replayed memories of bedtime stories, laughter-filled mornings, and graduations, and I questioned how everything could slip so quietly into neglect. It felt as though I were invisible in my own daughter's life, a spectator to the growing bond she shared with Charles, and to her slowly widening distance from me. And yet, somewhere inside, a flicker remained, a stubborn spark of resilience. I will not disappear silently. I will not let my love be taken for granted. That spark, tiny but fierce, pulsed every time I remembered her first steps, her first words, the way she clutched my hand in moments of fear. I realized that my quiet suffering could no longer remain unspoken. Something had to shift. Something had to be done. By the time the next major incident occurred, I was already at my breaking point. My heart was heavy with betrayal, yet strangely steady with resolve. I knew the life I had built, the love I had given, was too precious to be dismissed, and the reckoning was coming. Whether Lydia realized it or not, the subtle hints of entitlement and distance grew into something cruel, something impossible to ignore. Lydia no longer hid her disdain for the sacrifices I had made, or for the life I had built. The moments of gentle neglect became sharp-cut words, spoken like knives, actions that humiliated me, gestures that made me feel invisible in the very home I had given her. Invitations to family dinners arrived as obligations. My presence was tolerated, never celebrated. The warmth we once shared was replaced with an icy tension that tightened my chest every time I entered her space. The first major escalation occurred during a business dinner she hosted at our home, a place I had furnished, maintained, and adored. Guests arrived, wine flowing, laughter filling the room. I offered polite congratulations, attempting to join in the celebration. Lydia's eyes flicked toward me briefly. Then she leaned toward Charles and whispered something I could not hear. Moments later, she said aloud, with that casual cruelty she now wielded effortlessly, "Mom, maybe you should sit in the corner. Don't want you knocking over the decorations again." right? Laughter followed from the table. I froze, my fingers curling around my glass until the edges dug into my palms. My own daughter had made me the source of amusement, a shadow in the spotlight of her life. Then came the smaller, almost invisible betrayals that stung more because they were personal. Invitations to family trips I had planned for years were cancelled with vague excuses. Calls I expected to hear every week went unanswered or returned hours later with an impersonal, dismissive tone, and money, which had been my gift freely given, was suddenly treated as entitlement. Lydia would make casual remarks about my finances in front of her friends. "Mom's really generous, but you know, she has quite a bit saved up." Her tone was light, but the implication was clear. She was calculating, measuring, evaluating my wealth against her convenience. The final straw before the breaking point arrived. One evening when I confronted her about a decision she had made with my name on the documents selling a property I had promised to keep in the family, she shrugged, almost gleeful, and said, "Mom, it's just business. Don't take it personally." That word business sliced through me. Everything I had built, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, reduced to numbers and strategy in her eyes. And yet, amidst the pain, a cold clarity emerged. I could feel the moment when empathy shifted to resolve. The betrayals, once subtle, had become obvious. The woman I loved as my daughter had been quietly replaced by someone else, entirely self-serving, unrecognizable. It was cruel, it was personal, and it was deliberate. I realized then that the time for quiet suffering was over. The stage was set, the cracks were wide, and I understood with piercing certainty everything was about to change. Something had to be done, and I could no longer wait for her to see reason. The night of my breaking point arrived, like a storm I had sensed for years but had been powerless to stop. Lydia's promotion celebration was in full swing, the house alive with glittering lights, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. I stood in the marble foyer, a small blue-wrapped box in my hands, my gift for her, on my own birthday. But no one noticed me, not the guests, not Lydia, not even the staff who scurried past as though I were air. I watched her, radiant and magnetic, leaning into Charles' arm, posing for photos, basking in attention that should have been mine to share. Then came the cruel words, tossed lightly like a feather but hitting me like a stone. "My mom, oh, she's here somewhere, just visiting, not really part of the night." Laughter followed, polite but sharp. I felt the weight of the box pressing against my chest, my fingers trembling, my heart twisted, disbelief mingling with the rising anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. A guest brushed past, spilling champagne onto my sleeve, murmuring, "Oh, sorry, ma'am. Staff should really stay in the kitchen area." Staff, me, my daughter's words and actions reduced me to a bystander in the home I had created. Every memory of mornings, baking cookies, evenings, reading bedtime stories, years of sacrifices flashed before my eyes. The invisible tally of love and dedication seemed meaningless now. I swallowed hard, summoning every ounce of composure left. I approached Lydia, my voice soft but steady. "Sweetheart, it's my birthday today." Her glance barely met mine. "Mom, please don't make this about you. Tonight is important for me. Can we not do this right now?" The casual cruelty in her tone ignited something inside me, a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and a fury I could no longer contain. The final blow came seconds later. She waved a waiter over. "Can someone help my mother get an Uber?" That was it. My body went still, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The box slipped slightly from my fingers, and the room spun around me. I realized then that I had been invisible to my daughter for far longer than I had admitted. The warmth I had poured into her life, the sacrifices that had defined me, the love that had been unconditional, none of it mattered. And yet, in that shattering moment, clarity emerged. My voice over, stone cold but trembling with restrained emotion, cut through the noise. That was the moment I decided something that would change everything, because what Lydia didn't know was that she was about to lose far more than a birthday. I stepped away from the marble foyer, each step a silent promise to myself. The party continued around me, oblivious, but inside, the gears were already turning. Years of quiet suffering had sharpened into resolve. Every betrayal, every slight, every discarded memory of devotion had fueled a fire I could no longer ignore. I looked at the blue-wrapped box in my hands, not just a gift, but a symbol of everything she had overlooked. And in that instant, I knew with unshakable certainty, I would not be dismissed. I would not be invisible. This was the moment my plan began, and nothing Lydia could do would stop it. After that night, everything changed. I returned to my home, the quiet of the empty rooms wrapping around me like a cloak, and the blue-wrapped box, my own birthday gift, still waiting on the table. I let the anger settle into focus. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was clarity. Lydia had underestimated me. She thought she could dismiss decades of love, sacrifice, and patience without consequence. She was wrong. The first step was subtle. I reviewed every account, every property, every investment I had painstakingly built over the years. Nothing flashy, nothing silly, no disquiet, old money wealth that even Lydia, ambitious as she was, had never fully understood. My advisors had always spoken in hushed tones, respecting my discretion. Now, that discretion became my weapon. Everything she assumed as hers by birthright was still under my control, and I intended to remind her exactly who held the power. I began testing the waters. Casual conversations, small hints about legal matters, and questions about her understanding of my estate. Her reactions were revealing impatience, subtle panic, a faint glimmer of fear masked by charm. I watched her closely, noting every glance, every flinch, every tiny slip that exposed her true priorities. Then came the strategy. I began quietly shifting assets, restructuring trusts, and finalizing legal documents that made it clear Lydia would not inherit a single thing without fulfilling obligations she had long ignored. The work she had dismissed as irrelevant, acknowledging me, respecting my presence, understanding the sacrifices behind her comforts now carried weight. Every misstep, every moment of neglect she had shown, would cost her dearly. The payoff was slow, deliberate. Lydia started noticing small tensions emerge, questions she couldn't answer, delays she hadn't anticipated, legal notices that arrived like silent thunder. Her carefully constructed confidence wavered. She smiled for others, but I saw the unease behind her eyes. Every interaction reminded her that the mother she had taken for granted was no longer powerless, and it worked. She realized, finally, that I was no longer invisible, that my love had limits not in generosity, but in tolerance. The woman she once dismissed with a flick of her hand now held control over what she thought was inevitable. Karma, I realized, is not instant. It is precise, patient, and satisfying when executed with intention. By the time the dust settled, I had reclaimed my dignity. The blue-wrapped box, still unopened, symbolized more than a birthday forgotten. It was proof that love given freely does not equate to weakness, and that betrayal, no matter how subtle or sustained, always carries consequences. Lydia had learned the truth. The mother she thought she could dismiss had orchestrated the reckoning, and the balance of power had shifted forever. In the weeks that followed, the world Lydia thought she controlled began to crumble, not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet inevitability. The legal documents I had prepared were precise, ironclad, and irreversible. Every asset, every property, every account was realigned in a way that reflected the respect and acknowledgement I had been denied for decades. She had assumed my love guaranteed her control, that my generosity would shield her from accountability. She was wrong. Lydia's confidence faltered quickly. Invitations she once expected were now carefully measured. Conversations that were once ignored were now gateways to understanding that her previous behavior carried real consequences. Her polished charm could not erase the realization that she had underestimated me. The friends she bragged to about my wealth began noticing the tension. Whispers of legal matters reached her social circle, and even Charles, who had once seemed untouchable, now watched helplessly as the daughter he had helped cultivate into entitlement faced the boundaries she had ignored. I watched it unfold with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. There was no joy in her struggle, only the necessary satisfaction of fairness. Lydia had to understand that love is not a commodity, and that respect cannot be demanded without reciprocity. My quiet life, my years of sacrifice, my careful investments, they were never tools for domination. But they had become the instruments of justice she could no longer evade. In the end, I reclaimed my peace. The mansion that once felt like a courtroom for my humiliation became just another property under my stewardship. The blue-wrapped box sat untouched, a silent witness to the lessons she had learned too late. Lydia had been forced to see that dismissing a mother, a woman who had given everything, carries consequences that cannot be ignored. I stepped back into my quiet home, the sun filtering through familiar windows, and allowed myself a deep, measured breath. The storm had passed. The reckoning was complete. And though the relationship with my daughter remained fractured, the scales had finally balanced, and I felt the weight of betrayal lift just enough to allow peace into my life. Looking back now, I realize that the hardest lessons are the ones taught by those we love the most. Betrayal is a quiet thing, often masked in ambition, charm, or entitlement, and it can grow unnoticed until it consumes the space between hearts. I had spent decades giving everything to my daughter, believing that love alone would protect our bond. I was wrong. Love protects, yes, but it cannot replace respect, accountability, or awareness of what is owed in return. I hope my story reminds anyone watching that generosity without boundaries can be taken for granted, and that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. There is a delicate balance between giving and protecting oneself, and understanding that balance is the difference between heartbreak and empowerment. It's painful to accept that someone you devoted your life to may prioritize personal gain over shared history, but it is also liberating to reclaim your voice, your dignity, and your power. I learned that revenge, when measured and thoughtful, is not about cruelty. It is about justice, clarity, and restoring balance. It is a reminder that those who dismiss your value will eventually see the consequences of their choices. And finally, I learned that life continues beyond betrayal. Even after loss, humiliation, or disappointment, there is space for peace, for quiet joy, and for the recognition that your worth was never diminished, even if it was ignored. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a mother who knows her own value.